I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome James Akerman to join us at the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. Just to give you a bit of background, for those of you who don't know him, he received his PhD in geography from Pennsylvania State University in 1991 and has dedicated his career to the study and teaching of the history of cartography. He's been director of the Newberry Library's Hermon Dunlap Smith Center for the History of Cartography since 1996, and the library's curator of maps since 2011. His research publications primarily concern the history of travel mapping, popular cartography, and atlases. He's the editor and co-editor of 6 collections of scholarly essays, including Cartographies of Travel and Navigation from 2006, Maps Finding Our Place in the World, which he co-wrote with Bob Caro in 2007, The Imperial Map in 2009, Decolonizing the Map in 2017, and the forthcoming Mapping Nature Across the Americas, which he's working on with Kathleen Brosnan. So today, we're going to be hearing about A View from the Road, travel mapping and American identity. And Jim tells me that he's been working on this project since he was a child, which is a marvelous story because it emerges from a childhood of love of travel and American history. It was his affection for and collecting road maps that drew into academic geography and the study of the history of cartography in particular. So the Newberry's acquisition of several map archives in the 80s and 90s prompted him to study the history of American road mapping. And that yielded his first major project as the director of the Smith Center, an exhibition which was entitled Paper Trails, Maps, Highways, and American Journeys in the 20th Century, which was mounted at the Newberry in 1996. It also prompted the edited Nebenzahl volume, Cartographies of Travel and Navigation from 2006. Since then, the largest share of his research and publications have been devoted to the history of American travel mapping since independence. He's fundamentally concerned about the relationship between the published artifacts of that history to technological change and the complexities of American identity. He's also interested in the format of travel maps and guidebooks, the interest behind their publication, and their use by consumers. These themes are fundamental to an exhibition he's preparing for 2022, which will be called Crossings, Mapping American Journeys. And this talk largely draws upon the themes and objects he's wrestling with for that exhibition, but also looks back on the exhibition from 1996. So without further ado, and I have to say I am really looking forward to this, I would like to welcome Jim to present this evening's TOSCA. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. And thank you, Nick and Liz, for inviting me to give this talk. Good morning from Chicago, that exotic location in the middle of the North American continent, and good afternoon and evening for wherever you may be. If you have been mystified by American behavior recently, you are not alone. In the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, President-elect, now President Biden, was foremost upon the many politicians who insisted that this is not who we are. But I heard plenty of audio from participants in the day's protests and violence who said that they were normal, law-abiding American patriots. Putting aside the disinformation that led many of them to that place and time, these statements crystallize what has been clear to anyone who is paying attention to the United States for the past decades, that what it means to be a normal, law-abiding, patriotic American, a status that touches both one's identity and one's rights as such, has never been more fraught, in my lifetime at least, than it is today. I mention this here because not because I want to pursue that rabbit hole very deeply, but because the way that I have been thinking about this talk has changed since I was invited to give it last fall, not perhaps in its content, but in the questions it poses to me as speaker, and I hope to you as an audience. but me in particular as a white middle-class American raised in post-war suburbia who has his whole life thought of himself as a normal, law-abiding American. It might help to point out that much of the public anger of the past year on this side of the Atlantic, however deep its social and ideological roots, has been stoked by the loss or serious restriction of something that many Americans feel lies at the heart of their historical and cultural identity, their geographical mobility. With the obvious exception of indigenous Americans, indigenous citizens, most Americans are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants, most of whom arrived within the last six generations. Internal migrations are also salient elements of the national story, embracing the overland journeys of pioneers, the corresponding displacement, if not destruction, of Native American communities, and the great migration of African Americans from south to the north and west from the 1880s through the 1960s. The collective national memory also reveres both extraordinary journeys, such as that undertaken by the explorers Lewis and Clark from St. Louis to Oregon in 1804 to 06, and the ordinary journeys of automobile tourists out to see America. Even vagabonds and wanderers, hobos, Western mountain men, the mythical Paul Bunyan, and the lyrical Sal Paradise, who is beat writer Jack Kerouac's semi-autobiographical protagonist of the novel On the Road, have a place in national folklore as symbols of American restlessness and self-reliance. Now, I know I may have lost you with some of these cultural and historical references, so I have a little bit of a disclaimer. It doesn't really matter whether you know anything about the events I will be referring to today. I invite you to consult Wikipedia afterwards if you wish. What matters is that these are historical and cultural landmarks in American literature and in the education and public memory of many Americans, at least those of a certain age, that are prominently represented and interpreted in American literature and travel mapping, if and often badly, and often at the expense of other narratives that should be represented. As Nick said, 25 years ago, I organized here at the Newberry an exhibition called Paper Trails, Maps, Highways, and American Journeys in the 20th Century. It was on the occasion of the centennial of the first commercially sold automobiles in the United States. It was on the whole an optimistic work, reflecting the perspectives, again, of a white suburbanite raised in the decades after the Second World War, who, while conscious of the environmental degradation and metropolitan sprawl wrought by the America's love affair with automobility, and of the social inequities intrinsic and exacerbated by the car, chose this exhibition to dwell on the association of the automobility with liberty in the weaponized American sense of the term, with citizenship and with American identity. Historian Douglas Brinkley, introducing the magic bus, an account of a college American history course he taught on a chartered bus, suggested that to, quote, to find liberty in America, the notion enshrined in our nation's birth announcement, that sought after sensation of freedom, hop in your car and drive in any direction for 5 hours at any speed on any highway or road, with no objective, no one to meet, alone behind the wheel. As if to underscore the point early in the trip, Brinkley notes that the bus driver, quote, pulled out a giant Rand McNally road map of the United States, which he enrolled with all the dignity and respect of a Talmudic scholar opening a sacred scroll. He was proud of the map. With it, the magic bus could go anywhere. I was particularly interested in 1996 in the way that automobile travel was promoted as a form of national education for young people, even a rite of passage into full citizenship. This was not a new idea about the role of travel, obviously, but the equation of domestic travel in the United States with, at least in the United States, the equation of domestic travel with patriotism dates back to the decades after the War of 1812 with Britain. In his tour from the city of New York to Detroit in the Michigan Territory from 1819, William Darby remarked extensively on the still recent conflict. He included a detailed map, of which you're seeing a detail here, called the Straits of Niagara, which clearly marked the location and dates of the battles of Queenstown, Chippewa, and Lundy's Lane, and the locations of Fort George and Fort Erie at either end of the Niagara River. The American Civil War was the occasion for the commercialization of battlefield tourism on a scale previously unknown, and with it the publication of maps and guides to support it. No battle received more attention than the decisive three-day conflict at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1 to 3 July 1863. The panorama of the battlefield prepared by John B. Batchelder for his Gettysburg, What to See and How to See It is illustrated here. Batchelder was an artist with a military background who attached himself to the Union Army of the Potomac in 1862, hoping that he might record in word and image the decisive battle of the war. When it became evident that Gettysburg might be that decisive battle, he surveyed the field over a period of 3 months after the battle, sketching and recording observations that would allow him to produce an isometric map that became the basis for this guidebook. He published it in the guidebook along with a compass, which you see at lower right, which allowed visitors to the battlefield to get their bearings of different parts of the battlefield where particular events took place. Signaling that the preservation and interpretation of Civil War battlefields was in the national interest, the federal government established dozens of national military parks in the 1890s, which are now administered by the National Park Service. And this is one of the brochures from that. During World War II, the United States Railroad during World War I, the United States Railroad Administration and individual railroads, noting that Europe was closed to tourists and hoping to revive the struggling American rail passenger industry, developed a promotional campaign urging Americans to, quote, see America first, a phrase that has resonance today, unfortunately. This campaign, with clear isolationist overtones, designed in part to redirect the tourism dollars of wealthier Americans accustomed to travel in Europe to spend their money at home instead. In the 1920s, these sentiments were easily transferred to automobile tourism. Writing of his 1927 transcontinental journey by car with his wife and 6-year-old son, Frederick Van de Water observed that at the end, we were no longer New Yorkers, but Americans, which we learned was something hearteningly different. My son, when he comes to study geography, will not consider the Rockies as a series of tiny eyelashes spread across a map. He will know the Mississippi is dirtier than the Hudson, and the Missouri dirtier than either, and the Columbia wide and swift and a greenish blue. Well, Wyoming will not be to him a mere purplish rectangle among the dismal assemblage of western states. He will recall instead the drab rangeland and aromatic smell of the sage and the harsh, bold outline of the mountains against a wide sky. And he will remember that the little place in its northwest corner, uninterestingly labeled Yellowstone Park, is vivid with bears. In addition to the access the automobile and automobile highways provided to iconic national scenic wonders, such as Yellowstone National Park, there was the car's ability to retrace, in a literal sense, the movements of individuals and communities deemed important to the national narrative. So, for example, we have the Lincoln Heritage Trail, which was meant to follow Abraham Lincoln's traverse before he became president across Kentucky and Indiana and into Illinois, ending up in Springfield. There is a small cottage industry, I guess you'd say, devoted to mapping overland trails for tourists. This is an example produced in 1982 by Gregory Francois. Whatever the positive civic contribution motor tourism made to national life. The 1996 exhibition also acknowledged that the nuclear families learning American history depicted on SO map covers from the 1950s and 1960s were so depicted as uniformly white and middle class. Throughout the era of free oil company roadmaps, African Americans and indigenous peoples never appeared in cover art as motorists, as consumers, but they do appear as part of the landscape. In the mid-20th century, specialized guidebooks such as the Negro Motorist Green Book, made famous by the recent film, The Green Book, specifically addressed the needs of African American travelers who were not welcomed in every hotel or restaurant. Such books were published by people of color for people of color to erase the difficulties and dangers of travel for non-whites. And this is another example in our collection. And the pictures and pictorial maps in the mid-century made to entice tourists also marked this dichotomy between the urbane white and the caricatures of the locals, not only Blacks and Indians, but also rural whites who were rendered as country bumpkins. The events of recent decades coming to a head in the past year have shown me that were I to revisit this narrative, as I am now doing, that mere lip service to those marginalized by national traditional narratives of American travel history, and for that matter, the history of American cartography, was no longer acceptable. To tell this more complex story of the identity of American travelers, it is also necessary to expand our notion of travel and travel mapping. Commonly, travel is taken to refer to journeys undertaken with the intent of returning to one's home or place of origin. This is contrasted with migration, which entails a permanent removal or relocation. In my experience, particularly within the American context, the distinction is not so easily made. Migrants are travelers too. They undertake their journeys for reasons that differ starkly, perhaps, from those of tourists: economic hardship, persecution, or simply the desire to relocate and make a better life in a new place. Yet migrants and tourists alike have followed the same pathways and continue to do so. The Ohio River did not follow one course for migrants and another for tourists. Mindful of this, Zadok Kramer's popular guide to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, The Navigator, which was published in multiple editions between 1801 and 1824, was devoted primarily to navigation instructions and provides information for migrants. But he also calls attention to sights and scenes along the way. And keep in mind that people are mostly moving fairly slowly along the river. So, for example, in a place just north of Pittsburgh, General Braddock's army was cut to pieces in a short period of time. This is a reference to the French and Indian War before the American Revolution, what Europeans will know as the 7 Years' War with the American theater. Braddock's army was cut to pieces in a short time, the Indians and French being completely covered by woods and grass. Kramer reported that the contemporary owner of the site frequently plows up the bones of those who fell in this dreadful carnage, and it is said that valuable brass piece may be sometimes seen in the very deep hole in the river opposite the field of battle, and the trees on the side of the hill still bear the marks of balls fired in the engagement. In 1917, wealthy leisure travelers might have ridden first class on the 20th Century Limited between New York and Chicago, while soldiers, students, and new Americans rode in coach. Yet the locomotives that moved them all at the same speed along the same rails and stopped at the same stops. Mid-19th century guidebooks made for travelers rarely distinguished between the migrant and the tourist, terms which had only been recently come into common use. Introducing his 1832 guidebook, View of the Valley of the Mississippi, or The Emigrant's and Traveler's Guide to the West, Robert Baird stated that his work was intended for those who desired to remove to the Valley of the Mississippi and there cap their loss, as well as for those who proposed to travel for amusement, health, or business in the West. Even into the 20th century, as this North Dakota map shows. It was promoting a travel to North Dakota for tourists. But you can see that on the back side of the map, there was also an advertisement suggesting that home seekers should relocate to North Dakota. The evidence of owner inscriptions show that the purchase of folded pocket maps in the 19th century that were the mainstay of the travel mapping trade reached into the heart of the expanding middle and literate classes in the United States. Amanda Jenny inscribed the inside of her copy of Colton's Western Tourist and Emigrants Guide, published in 1852, revealing that she was in Durham Township in Hancock County, Illinois, where she signed the map. Further research has shown that she was born Amanda Potter in Washington, Pennsylvania in 1813. Married Sherman Terrell of Marshall County, Virginia in 1830, with whom she had 6 children, all of with whom lived to at least the middle age. After Mr. Terrell died in 1859, Amanda married Wellington Jenny and moved with him to Hancock County before the census of 1860. The guidebook was published in 1852, and it is reasonable to assume that she acquired it sometime or before or immediately after her move to Illinois. The multiplicity of travel experiences must be mapped in multiple ways. I'm fond of making comparisons of a series of maps from the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, all dealing largely with the northern part of the United States. One of these is an inscribed travel guide by Zachariah Allen, who is a wealthy inventor and mill owner based in Providence, Rhode Island, who traveled to the Falls of St. Anthony in 1847 with his family, ostensibly on a family vacation. The Falls of St. Anthony are, by the way, at the site of Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota. But it's clear that he was also interested in the mechanics of, in the physics of the waterfalls themselves. But he kept this as a memento of his trip. At the same time, roughly the same time, an Iowa chief named Nochi Ninga prepared this map, now in the National Archives in Washington or outside Washington, for a conference held in Washington of Indian tribes living in the northern Mississippi. His name translates to no heart of fear, and he drew this map to show that his people had always occupied the lands drained by the upper Mississippi and that the land was theirs. The pending treaty settlements would instead honor another Indian tribe, the Sac, for their claims to the future state of Iowa, because the Sac were the current occupants, having displaced themselves from their traditional lands in northern Illinois and Wisconsin as a result of encroaching white settlement and the recent Black Hawk War, an event commemorated by a traveler of another sort, Colonel Edwin Rose, who served with Army forces led by General Henry Atkinson, which forced in a brief campaign in 1832, a confederation of Sac, Fox, and Kickapoo bands led by Black Hawk across the Mississippi into modern Iowa and Minnesota. One of the beneficiaries of the removal of most indigenous communities from Illinois and Wisconsin was Otto Rollman. His inscription on a German map of the United States tells us that he bought it in 1844, quote, before his immigration to the United States, when he settled in Wisconsin. Again, I've been able to determine that Mr. Rollman was born in West Prussia in 1818 and did indeed arrive in Wisconsin in 1848, settling in Marshfield Township in Fond du Lac County. He was part of a massive wave of German and other Western and Northern European immigrants who traveled to the Midwestern US from the 1830s on through the end of the 19th century. I count among my German and Swedish ancestors 4 generations removed, part of this wave, who arrived in Chicago as children and young adults in the 1880s. Most of these European migrants arrived by ships out of ports like Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp, and Göteborg, as well as, of course, as several British ports. Then they traveled via North American ports, most famously New York City, then via canal, railroad, the St. Lawrence, and Great Lakes cities to farmlands across the United States. This census atlas documents from 1898, documents well the extent of foreign-born population, much of it Northern European or Western European, in the northeastern part of the United States during this time. Also in 1898, William Siebert published his maps of the routes of the Underground Railroad, a loose network of trails and safe houses by which fugitives from enslavement crossed into the North, most heading on to Canada. The height of this migration, numbering something on the order of 1,000 people per year, was also at its height in the 1840s and 1850s. The name Underground Railroad reflected the contemporary popularity of the railroad as a symbol of American progress and mobility, but no published maps or guidebooks will mention these particular travelers. They mostly avoided the main routes, and their passages could not be mapped. It fell to latter-day scholars like Siebert to map out their routes based on accounts made by those still living or documented by contemporary freemen, formerly enslaved Blacks and aid societies. During this time, Niagara Falls was, of course, as it still is, one of the most important resorts in North America, which straddles the boundary of the United States and modern Canada. Dozens of guidebooks were published in the first part of the 19th century and afterwards commemorating this. One from 1859 by Lydia Sigourney includes a number of illustrations of popular sites along them. Among them was the recently constructed iron suspension bridge across the Niagara River, constructed by John Roebling of Brooklyn Bridge fame. It was constructed in 1854. And the guidebooks talk about this as being a marvel of modern engineering. What they don't mention is that this was one of the last stations for many people traveling on the Underground Railroad because it provided a very relatively easy passage across the boundary into freedom in Canada. To tell these kinds of stories, I hope I've illustrated, we need a more capacious definition of travel mapping, which I define as the process or processes by which maps, texts, images, and other representations are made by and for travelers, are created, recreated, distributed, and used. The term is used broadly here to include not only graphic maps, but also texts, oral communications, and performances that guide travelers and help them make sense of the localities and landscapes through which they travel. These include functional maps like this road map, promotional maps, pictorial maps, guidebooks combining maps and images with narratives, the artwork surrounding the construction, surrounding and the packaging of road maps, the backsides of road maps. This is an official state highway map of Michigan from 1942, which promotes the contribution of the industries around Detroit to the American and international war effort. And as we have already seen, the annotations of maps. In this case, we're looking at an annotated guidebook to the California Trail in which the traveler marks the various places where he stayed along his journey in 1850. And even maps such as real estate or fire insurance maps. This is a map of the Lower East Side of 1885, which can be interrogated for what it reveals about the celebrated ethnic enclave within Manhattan, at the time largely the destination of a number of Jewish, a large number of Jewish migrants largely from Europe, but including over time many other locations. And even ambient maps, as this roadside guide to Route 66 as it travels through Springfield, Illinois, complete with a statue of Abraham Lincoln holding an American flag outside a car wash, is something that we should be paying attention to as a manner of mapping the landscape. The promotional rhetoric of the travel mapping mainstream documents only obliquely the movements of colonized and enslaved peoples, of communities of color, and the impoverished. And we must read between the lines of the mapped record to detect and elucidate these movements. One approach, which gets at the very heart of the complexities and contradictions of the history of American travel and migration, is to be geographically specific. I have been particularly attracted by some of the more durable pathways across the continental United States, whose significance transcends time and space and the experiences of particular classes or groups. Let's call one of these, which I'll spend a little time on in what remains, the Northern Passage, a name that plays on the Northwest Passage. The premonition that this might indeed be a route out of the Hudson's River across the continent is made explicit by several 17th century maps, including this by Virginia Farrar from 1650, which shows the Hudson over at the right here, linking out to an amorphous set of bodies, probably the Great Lakes, and leaving ultimately out into the Pacific Ocean, and California named as Nova Albion by Sir Francis Drake. The first leg of this journey was the Hudson River itself, and a passageway which follows lowlands between a break in the Appalachian Mountains and the Adirondacks to the north, which is called the Mohawk Valley and links through the Mississippi, links through the Finger Lakes, ultimately into the eastern Great Lakes. As the Cadwallader Colden's map from 1727 illustrates, the Haudenosaunee, what we know as the Iroquois Confederation, however, stood in the way of this route. And to put it bluntly, one of the tasks of the early state of New York and the American government was to move them away from this profitable and lucrative route. The first stage of this was the construction of the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, which required previous removal by treaty of a number of Haudenosaunee communities under the guidance of the Holland Land Company. This is a map from 1804 that shows the last states of this removal, and you can maybe make out some of the smaller reservations that the Iroquois were left with. A more detailed map, looking at a detail of an early Erie Canal map, we see how closely the route of the canal actually followed an older wagon road, which in effect was the older Haudenosaunee trade route. The construction of the Erie Canal contributed greatly to the development of the Hudson River, both as a tourist route and as a route of commerce. And for more privileged travelers, they might purchase a copy of Wade and Crude's Panorama of the Hudson River from New York to Albany, which would allow them to look at the two banks of the Hudson River on their journey. This route was closely followed by the New York Central. I'll look at a detail of the New York Central Railroad, which was basically conceived in the 1830s and to 1850s. Looking at a detail of this 1878 Rand McNally map, you can see how closely the route of the railroad parallels the Erie Canal that preceded it. And ultimately, the modern superhighway known as the New York Thruway followed this route directly. publicity published by the New York Central well into the 20th century made much of the heritage, the historical connection of this route to the pioneers. Farther to the west, the Northern Pacific Railroad was conceived as a link that would bring traffic from the western Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, the Puget Sound and the Columbia River. It was chartered in the 1860s, but built mostly, but not completed until the 1880s. This too was a player in the removal of indigenous communities. Best well known were the Siouan peoples, the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. The Dakota, who are the easternmost Sioux, were in fact the subject of a very violent removal in the 1860s while the American Civil War was raging. And this map documents some of the treaty settlements that preceded and followed the removal from, by and large, from what is Minnesota, again, out into the Dakota Territory. Into the breach flooded Northern European immigrants lured by publications, sometimes printed in German, for example, by the Northern Pacific itself. Just to the south of the road, this became, of course, an important tourist corridor in the 20th century. Just to the south of this main route is the Black Hills region of South Dakota, which for Siouan peoples and Cheyenne and other Northern Plains Indians was an historic locality, much honored by to this day by those peoples of this area. One of these people was Amos Badhart Bull, who drew this map of the Black Hills for an anthropologist in the 1930s, shortly before he died. The map was buried with him, but Badhart Bull had actually lived through many of the struggles that the Siouan peoples associated with white incursions into the Northern Plains. And their plight is, I think, well illustrated by this tourist map of the Black Hills from the 1940s, which shows a collection of white Americans mostly doing things that tourists do, celebrating the West, while American Indians are being shown way off into the margins, viewing the activities somewhat wistfully from the area that they have been displaced from. That's not entirely what the tourist map authors intended, but it is certainly the way it comes across to modern eyes. Still farther west, the story of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark is much celebrated in American education about the American West. And the Northern Pacific made much of the correspondence of the route of the rails across the Northern Rockies, is paralleling that of Lewis and Clark. And this too has been celebrated as a National Historic Corridor of the modern National Park Service. What the common story perhaps does not emphasize enough is that Lewis and Clark were highly dependent on several native communities in the Northern Rockies, especially the Nimipu, or which we know as the Nez Perce, who helped them find their way across some of the more difficult passages in the Northern Rockies. Half a century later, the Nez Perce were part of another national drama called the Nez Perce War in 1877, where the last portions of them were ousted from their traditional homelands in northern Idaho and forced into reservations. The exploratory map of Charles Wilk and J.H. Young, celebrating the celebrating the American entry into the Northwest Territory makes much of the presence of these native tribes and communities in later, at the time that he encountered Oregon. But as we look at modern tourist maps, we will see that the pictorial vignettes that are associated with the consumption of the landscape don't really make any mention of the still persistent presence of a large number of Native American communities in this area. Mindful of time, I want to speed ahead to the National Road to talk about this important highway that was one of the first national projects, infrastructure projects in the 1820s, much celebrated by later lore. It serves as a symbol of American fortitude for many of us, and inventiveness, and the difficulties of crossing the Appalachians, and became ultimately what is now US 40, as appears moving across northern Maryland on this Brad McNally road map. What is often not told is that was during this time, this was also during its original use, it was also a passageway for the transport of enslaved peoples. And these are a couple of accounts of those movements by white observers. One, so some of the old citizens of Uniontown, Pennsylvania will remember the time when scores of poor slaves were driven through that place, handcuffed and tied 2 and 2 on a rope that was extended some 40 to 50 feet on one side. Here is Uniontown. In the winter of 1828, that's another one. In the winter of 1828, I put up for a night at Frostburg on the National Road down over here. Soon after, a slaver arrived with a drove of slaves. I then left the room and shortly afterwards heard a scream. And when the landlady inquired the cause, the slaver coolly told her not to trouble herself. He was only chastising one of his women. It appeared that 3 days previously, her child had died on the road and had been thrown into a crevice in the mountain. And the mother, weeping for her child, was chastened by her master and told by him she would have something to cry for. On this modern map, we will note that Braddock's grave and the events of the French and Indian War are the only grave sites that are noted in this map. But I want not, I didn't leave myself enough time as usual to go through some of this other material, and perhaps in questions we can go after that. But I want to not just portray the traditionally marginalized people that are left out of the standard stories of American travel and expansion entirely or solely as victims. One of the more positive stories coming out of the Great Migration, which marked the movement of African Americans in the post-Civil War era, from the 1880s to even into the 1960s, from the South to the North, is that this in train spread the news, the music that they first developed in New Orleans, specifically in a place called Congo Square, which was an only place in New Orleans where Africans, free Africans and enslaved Africans were allowed to congregate. And it is often called the birthplace of jazz. Farther to the north, the fields, the former cotton plantations were turned into places where sharecroppers were, African sharecroppers were effectively tied to the land. Specifically in what is called the Mississippi Delta or the Yazoo Delta, the portion of Western Mississippi that is part of this, that was first developed by, was a later part of the antebellum era, and because of the fertile bottomlands was a great place to grow cotton. It was also the birthplace of the blues. Most of the, and I'll just lead, I found this wonderful map from 1934, which is a period of important crystallization of the modern, what is called the Delta Blues, which moved north to St. Louis and Memphis and ultimately to Chicago, along the US Highway 61 and the Illinois Central Railroad, which stopped in Clarksdale at the center of the Delta. It is from this location that people will be familiar to those of you who know a little bit about American folk music and blues. People like Son House, Charlie Patton, Howlin' Wolf, often called one of the fathers of modern rock and roll, Muddy Waters, the father of the Chicago blues, and B.B. King, the great crossover artist from blues and jazz to rock and roll. All were born, most of them the sons of sharecroppers, some of them having worked as sharecroppers before they moved north. The most famous of these is Robert Johnson, perhaps, who was born in 1911 near Tunica, the northern end of the Delta, and died tragically and under foggy circumstances in 1938. Johnson was rediscovered by a number of American folk musicologists in the 1930s and on into the 1950s, and by British musicians who were inspired by the blues. And many of you, certainly those of you who are of a certain age like me, will remember Cream's recording of Johnson's most famous song, Crossroads. It refers to the crossroad between Route 49 and Route 66, which was an important location of several juke joints where blues was performed. The words may have referred to this specific location, although they obviously carried larger metaphysical notions about Johnson's own struggles with demons that were facing him. Nevertheless, it is comforting, I guess, to know that on this road, which is now called the Blues Highway, this American music, this very American music of blues and jazz, moved northwards, ultimately becoming crystallized in places like Memphis and St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit and Philadelphia as rock and roll, one of America's national contributors to world culture, if you want to call it that. And what could, in the end, be more American than that? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. I thoroughly enjoyed that and learnt an enormous amount, not only about American identity, but American identities, because you brought out very effectively the dominant identity being portrayed and various marginalized identities which are visible to those who look. And I think we got the benefit of your having spent a lifetime looking. So thank you very much indeed. Now, Jim has very kindly offered to answer questions, and you can pose your questions in the Q&A facility, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Perhaps while our listeners and our audience are consolidating their thoughts, I could ask you something which occurred to me. What would the British equivalent of your maps be, and how might that feed into another aspect of American identity? And I was thinking that, in a sense, our travel maps, which speak to a British identity, are the very, very confident maps that you can find at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, showing imperial possessions, and particularly things like imperial shipping routes and imperial coaling stations, so the infrastructure of travel. Now, obviously, America's imperial exploits are informal rather than formal empire. But I wonder, is there a sort of corollary, an international corollary of the national maps that you've shown us, sort of picturing how Americans see themselves in the world and how they might travel to international destinations that are particularly resonant with their image of themselves?
You mean Americans' image of themselves, or
Yeah.
say British image? Yeah.
No, American,
Yeah.
in the sort of international complement of the national map
Yeah,
that you've
yeah.
shown us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, this invites a very long answer. Since many Americans think of, I think of themselves are as much interested in their European or their African or their Asian heritage as they are in the United States itself. It's something that's not exclusive to the United States by any means, but it is something that is particularly strong in America. Many Americans make very personal journeys. I live across the street from some Irish Americans who, until recently, made an annual pilgrimage to Ireland to visit homes that they, their ancestral homes. And I know that Polish Americans do this as well. There is increasingly a movement among African Americans now that we were able to find out more through DNA testing, by the way, to find out what parts of Africa they are actually from and try to reconstruct that. But I would say also Americans, I would say as part of this sort of mainstream narrative, the way that Americans frame themselves, and I say this as a predominantly German Americans, is largely in terms of their British experience. Our obsession with the British royal family, for example, which has manifested itself so spectacularly recently, is in fact has a corollary in our fascination with things that we know about British culture. So visiting Stratford upon Avon, which has its doppelganger in Western Ontario, or visiting the Thames, visiting the Tower of London. Those who trace their Scottish heritage might be interested in the battlefield at Culloden.
And are there US maps specifically for these pilgrims?
Well, only not of the type that you're looking at here. They're just our guidebooks, I think, which increasingly have a more internationalist. There was in the 19th century, early 20th century, a number of guidebooks that were produced for Americans who were participating, and interestingly, especially for women, who were making their version of the Grand Tour. If you know the book with the Little Women, it notes that particular phenomenon. And there were guidebooks that were specifically done for that now. But no, I think the market is too diffuse, I think, to go beyond the kinds of things that are, I could be wrong, but we do rely extensively on British publishers for that, for example.
Yeah. Thank you. One of our audience asks, says, I grew up using the free travel maps provided by oil companies. Is this practice typically American, or did other oil companies in other countries also do this?
Yes and no. There is, I point out that the Continental Tire Company published a road atlas of Britain in 1905, which is an example of which resides in the British Library that I saw several years ago. And although I think they perhaps charged for it, in places like Britain, a lot of this gap for touring maps was filled by published maps by firms like Bartholomew, or especially the Ordnance Survey. But in the United States, I think because of the large scale of the ground to be traveled, it became very desirable to produce fairly cheap maps. And oil companies, petroleum companies were especially interested in promoting this sort of travel. And so producing a cheap road map was a way of inspiring consumer loyalty. And so it had a particular use. You do see this translate into the 1930s, by the 1930s, with some American oil or non-American oil companies such as Royal Dutch Shell in producing their own road maps. Notably, there are maps from the 1930s of Germany that promote German national identity in ways that have, can't help but read with a somewhat askance. But it largely falls to after the Second World War that we see cheap maps, many of them published by American companies or their subsidiaries in Europe. And I think this has to do with the opening up to Europe of the longer distance travel. That's a glib statement. I see Ian Byrne, who knows more about the European map trade than I do, is popping up with some questions here and there, and I'm sure he'll write me and correct me on some of these things later.
Thank you for that. So another of our audience members asks, comments how interesting your talk was. That's a sentiment I'm sure we all share. Then goes on to ask, how did the WPA guides of the 1930s fit into this history? My memory is that they did include maps. If so, were they created specifically for those guides, and were cartographers hired for that purpose?
Yes.
Perhaps you could just explain what WPA.
Oh yeah, the WPA was a Depression era program called the Works Projects Administration, and they funded a variety of different, as opposed to the Public Works Administration, which was concerned with infrastructure programs. They were largely, but not exclusively, associated with the arts and literature, and especially putting, people who had lost their employment in those fields to work. And one of their great projects was this production of guides, mostly state guides, which I collected avidly in my younger days, but also guides to cities like New Orleans and New York City, which very specifically and reflecting the attitudes of the time were interested in recording not just the traditional stories, but also of individual localities, but also the folk stories and the lives of people normally not recorded in history. For that, some states actually, for the socialist overtones, some states actually cut short the publication of their guides. It's also in this effort that a musicologist named Alan Lomax is credited with making some of the early recordings of blues artists in the Mississippi Valley. Yes, they did have maps, which were both, there a simple map inside each book, which had at the end of each book, there was a series of tours that followed for the most part, US and state trunk highways, but in some case, railroads and waterways. There was a simple index map at the front, and then there was often a large fold-out map. Judging by the quality of those maps, they were made by people that were called themselves cartographers, and they were reasonably neat, but they were not produced by well-known companies. In fact, I'm scratching my heads to note whether I've ever actually looked to see who the authors of these maps were. They are reasonably polished, but they're fairly Spartan black and white productions. But that certainly, it reminds me that this is another way into this story that is peculiar to the 1930s in the United States and was sort of washed over by the 1950s, in the 1950s and 1960s. Good question. Thank you. Liz, we've lost.
Thank you. And perhaps briefly, you could comment on another question which feeds in really to what you've said, which one of our audience members points out that a lot of US road maps today stop at the state boundary. Is there a particular reason for this state-by-state approach to travel?
Yeah. Well, that's deeply ingrained. It goes back to the history of American atlases, even from the beginning of the Republic, which tended to organize. We've been very much reminded that we are a federation of sovereign states over the last year or so. This pattern is very much indelible in the way that American atlases for general use were constructed. And I dare say that educated and literate American school children well into by the 20th century had pretty much committed to memory the national map of the states. And this is, I'm sorry to say that this is a skill that many Americans, especially young Americans, no longer have, which I think is, for as silly as it may seem, as kind of an important skill. But it's true that we organize our geography in these ways. And this carried over into the construction of the first road atlases and the maps that were based on them. There are exceptions to this, and I will note that my favorite road atlas in print today is that produced by Michelin, which follows the pattern of Michelin atlases, so that it is rather organized geographically by scale into maps that overlap across the state boundaries. A lot easier if you're actually trying to go on the road and use it, if you indeed refer to a paper map for this purpose. But yeah, it's a good point. It's deeply ingrained in a way that I don't think is the case in Britain or just about any other part of Europe.
Thank you. And perhaps I could combine two other questions which focus on the content of the maps. One of our audience members is interested as to whether religious sites are particularly noted as icons or places to visit on the map. And another of our audience members wonders if federal maps particularly drew the traveler's attention to federal sites.
Yeah, well, two parts to that question. Yes, the answer is things like religious sites. You are all aware that America, the US is in all, despite official secularism, is a deeply religious country. And so there's a lot of attention to notation of particular, both locally and in some cases in those little points of interest that show up on smaller scale maps, to sites associated with particular religious groups or particular events associated with the founding of religious groups. The Mormons are particularly salient in that representation. But most localized maps of local communities will make much out of the locations of churches alongside schools and so on. And this is deeply ingrained as well in guidebooks that were produced for prospective migrants. Usually would make an accounting of things like banks and religious places of worship and schools as what testimonies that these very small, dusty towns were also centers of civilization out on the plains, so to speak. With regard to federal sites, the federal government has really made its business since the establishment of the National Park Service in 1915 to sponsor the publication of maps commemorating maps, things, something which would be, I guess, comparable to your national heritage sites and your organizations. And I showed a couple of examples of these, a commemoration of the Lewis and Clark Trail. There's also ones for the Mormon Trail. There is even a national corridor for the Trail of Tears, which is the route by which a large portion of the Cherokee community was forcefully moved from Tennessee and Georgia to Oklahoma in the 1830s. But there isn't, the hands of publication of general interest tourist maps is still largely in the hands of the state governments and of local agencies and chambers of commerce. The federal government does not take much interest in it in the way, say, the Ordnance Survey does in Britain. So there isn't a detectable pattern, at least that I've noticed, that sort of emphasizes whether, other than the publication of certain types of maps, that would produce this emphasis. Sorry for the long answer.
No, not at all. And I'll just let you get a drink of water there, or a cup of tea. We've asked you to speak for a long time, but the questions are coming in. People have obviously found your talk extremely interesting. I wonder if I could scoop together 3 questions. 2 of our audience members ask about the Newberry Library, its collecting focuses, and also its online presence, the extent of digitization. And that digitization leads us to another question of whether digital navigational tools, how they fit into this narrative of travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first of all, the Newberry Library is an independent research library located on the north side of Chicago. You can tell I've rehearsed those lines before. Devoted to the study of the humanities. We are open to the public, but we're not part of, say, the Chicago Public Library system. It's an independently supported library. Our collecting strengths are largely for the last deal with materials from the past half millennium, but then what library doesn't, I guess. But a particular emphasis in American and European materials, or materials produced by Americans and Europeans. And this spans not just travel and geography, obviously, but American literature, European literature, and the map collection really sort of reflects the other areas of interest. I would say one particular area of strength is our collection related to Indigenous and American Indian history, which goes back a century and makes us an important center for the study, both for Native communities and for non-Native scholars interested in that history. And, you know, that's perhaps where some of my sensibilities to this part of the argument comes from. Let's see, I remember the third part of the question, which is the question about digital materials.
Yeah, there was a question about the online presence of the library.
Yeah, regrettably, although this is changing rapidly, the Newberry is, you might have seen in my presentation that I dropped in a number of things that I borrowed from David Rumsey's map site and one from the John Carter Brown. We have a lot of material digitized, most notably, if you want to look very much on topic, there is a website that I produced with the collaboration of a number of authors about 10 years ago called Mapping Movement in American History and Culture. It's about to go through a migration, which is symbolic of the fact that we are finally establishing a much more user-friendly portal to our digital materials. I would say most of what you will find is not in terms of a mass database of individual images, although that will change, but in terms of specific projects. So I would direct you especially to our document-based teaching resources, which are written by scholars in the appropriate fields, and as a rich resource for that type of material. The digital presence of And you probably noticed, by the way, a lot of these pictures I showed you were taken with my own camera. Thank goodness for improved cell phone cartography, imaging, which was partly forced by COVID itself, which hampered our digital services ability to make reproductions for me. But yeah, I've gotten the question about where does digital cartography fit, digital, specifically GPS and navigational cartography fit into this narrative. I've gotten that question for about 30 years, I guess, really since about starting it. And the people who initially asked it were anticipating that paper maps would disappear altogether, and this hasn't happened yet. Perhaps when my generation dies off, it will. I thought a lot about this. I deliberately left it out of this particular narrative today because I did not want to go down to that particular rabbit hole. But we are at a point where people are thinking about, a number of my colleagues, most notably a young French scholar named Quentin Morcret, are thinking about how the cell phone itself is really changing the way that we orient ourselves, for good and bad. A lot of effort is spent in the kinds of maps I showed you that were explicitly made for travels, to try to put travelers in the landscape that they're experiencing as they're doing it. And that's difficult, and often you have to rely on text to do it. And we all know there are those among us who still can't orient ourselves with this. I will point out that whenever I'm trying to find my way as a pedestrian, I still get turned around even using my GPS and my phone. I have to walk in one direction to establish which end is up, and so frequently have to turn around. And that's a clue to the fact that what that GPS is doing really well is showing you where you are right now, but it doesn't put you in the broader context. And I think that the survival of paper maps to a considerable extent is reflective of the fact that we're not just interested in putting ourself in space in terms of celestial coordinates at a particular place, but also sort of having a sense of where the heck we are going. I don't know if that answers that particular question, but it's one way that I've thought about answering it. I would say that that chapter really hasn't been written yet, and I don't think I'll be the one to write it.
Thank you. Yeah, you comment on the richness of the Newberry Library's holding in Native American maps, and we've had a question about Native American matters. Many American roads follow traditional Native American trade and travel routes. Were there maps or atlases of these routes produced before they were established as formal roads?
Mostly not, but that is not to say that these maps weren't being made. They are ephemeral as nature. And I'm afraid a lot of the information we have about them is derivative from the accounts of European Americans that they were communicating with. Malcolm Lewis's edited volume, Cartographic Perspectives, will provide a lot of literature. I would recommend this to the person asking the question that would document some of this process. But that said, we know, for example, the Nimipu, the Nez Perce, made maps for Lewis and Clark that showed them how to get across the pass. And I haven't delved, I'm sorry to say, I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't delved deep enough into the archive of Lewis and Clark to know whether these archives survive. And certainly before I publish that particular part of the story, I'm going to try to do that. But there are any number of accounts of maps that have been drawn out in the sand or in the dirt or on paper And we know that they were users of maps as well, of material maps, shall we say. So, but mapping of the Indian trails we find these if you look, especially in the American Southeast, some of the best known maps that would say, for example, Bowen's map that appears in the American Military Pocket Atlas, or in John Mitchell's map of North America, or Guillaume Delisle's map from 1718 of the Mississippi Valley. You'll find very clearly native routes, trading routes, which were well known because it was a point of collision and contact between British and French colonial enterprise, and they're very mindful of that. This was an area where routes had to be cut through fairly dense forests and across riverscapes. So it's also regionally specific as to where mapping it out was, in what places mapping it out was necessary. There are also things like blazing trees and so on that were marked to indicate routes. These are things that are very common in my area.
Thank you. And we have two last questions, which I hope we can just squeeze in before we let you go. The first one is about sponsorship of travel maps. One audience member points out that in the UK, particularly in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century, there are many road maps which indicate the homes of wealthy landowners. Yeah. That you could see from the road, and it was hoped that the owners would either were sponsors or would become sponsors of these maps. So are there any examples of that from a US point of view? And a final question also talks about the content of these maps, looking at controversial urban renewal programs of the 50s and 60s, such as the Cross Bronx Expressway, and how those road maps are featured in our maps. So both questions looking at sort of complementary of the content of the maps.
Both fantastic questions. Sponsorship, it's certainly not on the aristocratic or the purely aristocratic model that is, well, then again, maybe it is, that is characteristic of Britain. But not so much road maps, but county land ownership maps. I didn't show you any examples, were based on the sponsorship model. They would obtain subscriptions from local landowners and note the location. Some cases illustrate their homes and farms, and would note these prominently on these maps and atlases that they created. This is a practice that dates back to the 1850s, and Michael Konzen, the University of Chicago professor of geography, has written extensively about this. A little later on, towards the period right around the American Civil War, that is right around 1860, this starts to translate into commercial sponsorship, which becomes a very common practice of the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So there is this very strong model that the people that were most likely to benefit from the publication of maps, such as railroads and petroleum companies, as we talked about earlier, are the sponsors of maps. We talk about these earlier county land ownership maps. We often, the way we talk about it as sort of the celebration of the yeoman farmer. So interested in Thomas Jefferson, who was anything but a yeoman farmer and a slaveholder as well. But in point of fact, the people that are represented in these county land ownership atlases and maps are primarily local elites. So although they're perhaps not from families that have been in that area for a very long time, They're families that in a space of a generation or two have firmly entrenched themselves in the aristocracy of that area. And so they show up in these land ownership maps. But by and large, these land ownership maps are not what we would call travel maps, although they are very good sources for road networks and railroad networks during that period. Second question about urban renewal. Yeah, I will just put a plug in, not for anything that I've done, but just the need for the study of the history of urban planning mapping. We can get at that interestingly, through the contemporary maps that were promoting, hopefully, some of these infrastructure projects. The person who associated with the Cross Bronx Expressway, and indeed with the construction of so much infrastructure in the middle of the 20th century in greater New York, is Robert Moses, who was also in very much associated with the establishment of the New York World's Fair of 1964 and 65, and the infrastructure that went along with that. He also planned a cross Manhattan Expressway, which never materialized, thank goodness. But he, of course, already by the end of his career was widely criticized for the destructive aspects of expressway construction, most notably by Lewis Mumford and Jane Jacobs. And you do see a subtle change in urban planning mapping, represented by a magnificent plan of New York published in 1969. A subtle realization that planning was no longer simply about, if indeed it ever was, about highway projects or promoting economic development, but had to be concerned with the social welfare of people. But you sort of have to read between the lines, look at the ideology about automobility that's reflected in the maps of the New York World's Fair of 1964-65. You have to do the same reading between the lines that I've talked about throughout this talk to get at those aspects of the story. But indeed, there are places where you can talk about this. I will just, in one last comment about that, one of my favorite atlases that we have at the Newberry Library for that I use in workshops for students is a Sanborn fire insurance atlas that was updated until the 1950s. I think you may not know Sanborn Company, but you know the term fire insurance atlas, I hope. And these were serially updated rather than republished as buildings were torn down and rebuilt. This particular one has shows the route of what was to become now known as the Eisenhower Expressway, an interstate route that heads directly west out of the center of the city. And the atlas is frozen in time. That is, it was stopped. They stopped updating it at the very moment when they pasted over the route of that expressway over the houses and structures that had to be removed to construct this expressway. But the paper is translucent, so you can still see those structures beneath it. And so it's that kind of sensitive use of the material object that might actually offer the best way of getting at these issues in ways that the original maps were not intended to do.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Jim. It's obvious that everybody has really enjoyed your talk and has learnt a lot about it, about maps as material objects, about the intersection of maps and identity, the whole idea of expressing mobility in a fixed object. And it's been a wonderful evening. So thank you again, Jim. We really enjoyed it.